it's not over complex. We're not looking at a whole new set of beneficiaries. We're looking at the same people that we've always been targeting, but now we're trying to equip them to this particular new challenge of climate change.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with sustainable ambassadors around the world about the work they're doing to solve the environmental, social, and economic challenges that we face. And so with that, I'm extremely excited to have Joanna Berry, who is a senior social development specialist at the World Bank, where she leads the team supporting the government of Madagascar on the resilient livelihoods in southern Madagascar. Work that includes a drought response for the current food security crisis in the south, and through which she's recently published a report entitled Understanding Social Vulnerability for More Effective Climate Strategies. And so with that, Joanna, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation.
All right, so as a starting point, it'd be great to know a little about yourself and the work that you're doing there at the World Bank.
So I'm a trained anthropologist. So I suppose I've always come with this perspective of wanting to know, what does development look like? What does it feel like? And how can it be done better at the local level? I'm particularly interested in the perspectives of local people, local realities, to inform what might be decided at a more national or international level on policy. So that's really been my driving goal. Keep it local, keep it real, and keep it rooted in the opinions and experiences of the people that we are partnering with.
And then what is the work of a senior social development specialist? Like, what is the work that you're doing? What's your mandate? And maybe what are some of the challenges that you're most concerned with through this position?
Yeah, so a senior social development specialist at the World Bank really does exactly that, tries to impart into the world of into the work of the World Bank this local, more community-based perspective. So a lot of our policy, a lot of our financing, a lot of our project making, of course, gets decided at a very macro, national, and global level. And really, it's my role to make sure that we connect with the perspectives on the ground to inform those decisions. So exactly kind of what's always driven my work, in fact. So it's great to have landed in a position that allows me to kind of use this anthropological social development perspective. And in general, the projects that we support as senior social development specialists are those which send financing through government systems to local communities, to local government, for more small scale changes. Small scale in terms of the level of financing, but obviously going to have big impact for local people.
What's the size and scale of, say, the budgets or the projects that you're working with? Is it, on the 10,000 community level, the 100,000, the million?
Yep. So at the moment, I'm focused, like you said, on this project supporting the government of Madagascar for development in the south of the island, which is a particularly poor and marginalized region. We funded the government of Madagascar to the tune of $250 million. That's been done over 3 financing waves. We have a target number of beneficiaries of 2.4 million people overall through the project, although different parts of the project, different activities have slightly different targets. But overall, 2.4 million, which is a really large proportion of the population in the South.
And then from the issues that you're working with, what are the general challenges that you're most concerned with through this? Is it climate change and then social, or is there a wider basket of challenges or issues that you're looking at?
So southern Madagascar's always been really poor and marginalized. It remains one of the poorest parts of the world. There are 91% of the population down there still living below the poverty line. There are historical reasons for that. There's been a lot of marginalization down there. It's a part of the country that's been quite discarded in terms of government priorities and international development priorities. So you already have this starting point of acute poverty, and then you bring climate change into the equation, and people are having to still do that scrabble for the basics of life, So the scrabble for water, the constant search for water, it's extremely arid part of the world. The constant search for any form of income, the constant search for healthcare. They're having to do all of that, which was already hard. Now they're having to do that in the context of climate change. So it's only getting harder to find water. It's only getting harder to make money out of agriculture because the conditions are changing. It's only getting harder to have any access to services because things are underfunded. So really, we're trying to turn that picture around to say, already it was a development challenge. Now it's even greater development challenge in the context of climate change and what can be done, not just to meet immediate needs, but to build longer term resilience for the population and for communities. And a really, really big part of that for us is that until local government is working and functioning and responsive down in the South, we're not going to be able to change that picture around. Yes, you can have humanitarian interventions. Yes, you can have food and water distribution. But really, the key to longer term sustainable development is going to be when local governments are functioning. So a lot of the project is about just supporting the basic functions of local government to be up and running, whether that's providing computers, whether that's building offices, so that they have more of a say in how the development's going to go down there. And that's the kind of, I suppose, what we're trying to build there is some form of institutional resilience, so that when these crises come, when this gradual and ever accelerating change of climate impacts come, there is some functioning government down there able to respond better to those.
How long have you been working on this personally, and what drew you to this project, or what is it that has driven you to the region itself? Because you've had a very long career in that region. What was the draw? What's the impact you were hoping to have, and how are you through this project maybe bring that to the market?
So I've been working on this particular project for the south of Madagascar for 4 years now. Honestly, it was something I was assigned and through a work rotation. So it wasn't particularly like I sought it out. But they needed someone with experience of particularly difficult contexts. I've come generally in the past, I've worked on more conflict affected areas and refugee crisis. So those populations that are really hard to reach, that are especially vulnerable, that are outside mainstream government services. So I guess management saw a good fit between that experience that I had for those kind of populations and then this population for southern Madagascar. And the real driving force to get this project off the ground was, like you said, because between 2020 and 21, there was a really severe drought in the area. So this all, like I said, this already really poor part of the world then just had no rainfall for a couple of years, which was catastrophic. So we kind of couldn't ignore it anymore. But we came in with this vision of like, okay, let's try and help the government stabilize things, but let's also look beyond that. How are we going to build up the resilience so there wouldn't be such a disaster again?
Okay. And that kind of would lead me to the report that you put out there about understanding social vulnerability for more effective climate strategies. Can you introduce the report itself, the research, and maybe some of the major questions that you sought to answer through it?
Yeah, I think we start the report with a basic premise, which is you can have two households in southern Madagascar which go through the same crisis. They go through the same drought, but their experience of that drought, the experience of that climate impact is going to be very, very different according to what's going on in that household. So, for example, a household where perhaps the male head of the household has already migrated out of the region. The woman of the household has been left behind to try and keep things going, has small children, but has very weak social capital, is really struggling already to get access to water. Her experience of that drought is going to be very different from, say, for example, a household where there's a steady source of income, where they have a good social network, where they've maybe got some stock, some savings in place to get them through this crisis. So same drought, same climate impact, same crisis, but two households going through that experience really, really differently. So there's a real differentiation of impacts. And sometimes we find in climate change work that gets really glossed over, because a lot of the climate change work at the moment is about modeling what the changes are going to be. They're modeling the exposure, they're modeling the risks, and we lose sight of the people who are affected by those things. And like I said, it's a very kind of basic premise, but different kinds of people in different circumstances are going to feel those impacts differently. And that means we need to be really nuanced in our response. So that household where it's a female-headed household with not much social capital and not much to work with needs a very different kind of response than the other kind of household. And that's what we're trying to do with this report, is really bring out some of those nuances and to say, not everyone has the same experience. And in new climate financing, we need to make sure that that financing is going down to the local level and is really responsive to those kind of differences.
The research, the conversations, they're really, as you mentioned, they're rarely nuanced in discussion. Why do you think that is? Like, why not look at the full spectrum of impacts on people more than say just the cool whiz bang environmental technological solutions that we have at hand? Like, what's the gap that you see there, and what are some of the roots to that challenge?
I think there are two. I've thought about this quite a lot, of how are we going to get traction around this conversation. And I think there are two things going on. I think the climate change exposure, the climate change modeling, um, is quite concrete. And it's quite, it's we're not saying the models are perfect, but it's something that people can put a lot of technology and energy into modeling and giving predictions and saying this is the pathway that we're going down. And it feels very concrete. It feels very concrete to say in southern Madagascar, the temperature is going to rise by this amount and precipitation is going to change by this amount. And we might be seeing more flash floods. That feels very concrete and easy to grasp. And there's a lot of energy going into it. And I suppose just as practitioners, we want predictability. We want to know facts and figures. So it's quite seductive. It's much more difficult to say, oh, it's complicated. It depends on the context. It's going to be different for this household and that house. That really kind of muddles the equation in a way that perhaps we don't quite have the capacity for at the moment. So I think one thing is that it just feels very complex, so people don't go down that route. It's easier to stay with the statistics and getting predictions and the models. I think the second reason is, honestly, it's quite political. It's very political to say, um, some of the reasons why people are more vulnerable to climate change than others is because of national policies. It's because they live in parts of the world that are marginalized or neglected or have discrimination against them. It's much easier, I think, politically to say, for a country like Madagascar, not putting, of course, words in their mouth, but it's easier to say, we are affected by climate change because of what the world has done to the climate. It's much more difficult to say we are affected by climate change because we have a population which is poor, has been neglected, which is marginalized, because the solutions for that are internal, they're domestic. There are domestic reasons why southern Madagascar is so poor. It doesn't need to look like that. So it becomes a much more politically difficult discussion with the government, rather than to say the cause of climate change is out there, it's external to us. We are not a player in climate change. It's a different conversation to say we are a player in the impacts of climate change because we have a poor population.
Hmm. So then where does your research fit into that gap? And what difference are you hoping that you can make with, maybe the policymakers, obviously in Madagascar, but obviously as well, outsider, and then the practitioners. How can you bring them into this? Because I think often a lot of research reports they're read by 7 to 10 people, 5 of which are probably your family members. Because it's a media report, and of course the podcasters like myself, but it's a media report. So where do you think your research fills this gap then? Because is it another report that the government's missing before they get enacted, or is it really the process afterwards that will help to fill that gap?
Yeah, we've only just put out the report, so the dissemination, the conversation around it is something that we're going to get going now. Have what we want to do is to get local thought leaders to engage with the key messages and raise the profile of some of the key findings. I think if there was one policy shift that we're shooting towards, that's simply to say more climate financing needs to go to the local level. So I think the statistic is that at the moment, only 11% of climate financing is channeled locally. So the majority of climate financing goes nationally or internationally. And there still isn't enough coming down to the local level because working on things like social vulnerability, marginalization, that woman who is in a female-headed household who now has to recover from the drought, that can only be done locally. And that needs financing flowing down to the local level. It needs community participation in deciding how to use that financing. It needs that woman and her family to determine their own needs and what would be the best response to it. And at the moment, all too little climate financing is doing that. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important. Of course, it's important to have national financing, especially around mitigation. But a lot of the adaptation work needs to be done locally, and we're just not finding those funds flowing down to that level. So I think that's really, if there was a top line policy change that we're targeting, it's that. That would be our advocacy piece. But I hope it will help empower practitioners to say, yes, I need to engage with the climate change science. Yes, I need to engage with the modeling, but I need to continue this engagement at the local level, having people define their priorities and their gaps. And that's going to be part of the fight against the impacts of climate change as much as mitigation is.
Going back to the challenge around the finance and kind of where the flows are, international, national, local, how much of that is by design, which is to say, the organizations themselves are still more oriented around the international components of these challenges, or the national, like getting the national infrastructure versus the local stuff, and how much of it is either a gap in capacity locally or a gap in trust between those who have the money internationally and their local partners?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think rightly so, we are holding countries to account. We are all holding each other to account on nationally defined contributions and meeting targets. And it's right that a lot of financing goes into that, and governments are under increasing pressure, but they're also under increasing motivation to meet those national targets. So I think it's partly that where people are choosing to spend the money. I think it's partly also that the money that goes to the local level is sometimes less trackable. It's harder to know, if you add up kind of the impacts for 1,000 of those households that I've described, it's harder to really come out with, well, this was achieved and this was the sum total. I mean, things like resilience and adaptation, they take years to change around, and it's very hard to track where the money's gone and into what kind of impacts. And then I think there's just a kind of still there aren't so many. We partner a lot through the project with NGOs who have amazing presence in in southern Madagascar, but they're not very kind of equipped or experienced with working with local government. So they're less equipped at being a mediator between the local population and the local government. And I think there just are still a limited number of partners who have that skill set to be able to make that bridge.
Backing out a little bit, through the work that you're doing, how do you find the climate hazards intersect between kind of poverty, marginalization, and governance challenges. Like, does this just exacerbate everything, or does it actually provide some focus? Because this is coming in, and now people are like, okay, we used to be too spread out. Now we can focus on a single issue, a single population, a single layer within, the different social stratas, as it were.
Yeah, I think actually in the project it has really provided focus because the project works in many sectors. Besides working with local government, it also invests in water, it also invests in reforestation and environmental protection, in combating coastal erosion, it invests in agriculture and alternative livelihoods, it invests in disaster risk management systems. And I think, pulling that all together under the rubric of this is all about um, adaptation to the impacts of climate change. This is all about building resilience. Does give a coherence to all those activities that I think could be quite fragmented. The challenge then is then to kind of get that conceptual coherence reflected into institutional coherence. So to have local government and mayors, local administrators who are seeing this really holistic picture that pulls everything together. But I do think it's helped in saying, this is our goal, this is our vision. Now it's all about the fact that this was an already very poor area and it's going to get worse if we don't do something about climate change.
And then from there, is it important to kind of really lay out the different layers in terms of, who's most at risk, what their conditions are, and then how to focus on or prioritize and then focus resources around them? Or are we still a little bit too far afield from being able to do that yet?
Think we can do that. I mean, it's not it's not kind of too hard to imagine that the already poor and vulnerable in society are going to be those most affected by climate change because their resources, their buffer zones, their safety nets are already so thin. So I think we can start with what we've already got. Who are already the most vulnerable? How are they being particularly affected by climate change, and what would be an intervention? So I think it's not over complex. We're not looking at a whole new set of beneficiaries. We're looking at the same people that we've always been targeting, but now we're trying to equip them to this particular new challenge of climate change.
Okay. But as you mentioned, like you've been working with them for a long time. So does anything need to change in the way that the engagements are, executed? Is it about just this is part of the process that's going to take 10 years, 20 years, generations to lift people out of poverty and then get them stable? Like, because I feel like, particularly like in the wake of US aid, there was a lot of discussion around, the idea or the challenge that countries, communities, they really become, reliant upon this funding, this support. They never really get their legs underneath them and move forward. I'm curious, like, how does that fit into the work that you're doing, or is that a concern you have? Is that something that fleshes out through the research itself?
Not really, because I think, the only reason why anybody is surviving in southern Madagascar at the moment is down to their own resilience. I mean, when you look at the fortitude of these people, when you look at what they have to do just to get food on the table, just to get, water for the kids, they're extraordinary. And there's no sense of kind of, they're sitting around waiting for the next aid package. No, they don't have that luxury. They're having to get on with it. Yes, aid packages really help. We hear that kind of time and time again, especially cash transfers that can buffer people through a particularly bad time. They really help. But it's not like anyone has, like I said, the luxury of sitting around waiting for an aid package. No, they have to get up in the morning and they have to survive. So I think yeah, that's our starting point is You already went through a lot. Look what you're managing to cope with. How can we come alongside you with the government to ease that burden a bit and allow you a bit more time and space to dream bigger dreams, not just where am I going to get water today, but how am I going to educate my children and what kind of future do I want for them? So I think, and that's what makes it inspiring as well. It's like, aid kind of patterns come and go and donors come and go, but that kind of fortitude and hardiness that people have is really the bedrock, I think, that keeps them all going.
So when you look like the outcomes of the research, what's the best way of helping, these communities then? I mean, they have the fortitude. It seems like there's some government capacity gaps, there's some funding gaps, but were there some particular levers or approaches that you're like, this is effective, this is efficient, this actually delivers real impact?
So we're still learning a lot. I mean, I think one thing that we do know that works is adaptive agriculture. So working with people to take their agricultural practices that they've been using for generations and saying, look, I mean, with this change in rainfall or with this change in temperature, it's just not possible to grow rice in the same way, or it's just not possible to count on this cash crop in the same way. And what are some different ways that we can think about growing rice that might need less water, that might respond to having hotter weather, that are going to be more marketable, perhaps? And what are some new value chains that might have potential? So one of the things that we've done is work with the government to introduce sweet potatoes into the south as a new crop, which tend to be quite drought resilient and are also are very nutritional. So as soon as you get that into a diet, you're already on a stronger foundation. But then there are some enterprise opportunities with value chains. It turns out, people can take them to market. They can use them for baked goods. So I think we know that that really works. Kind of people are still dependent on basic agriculture in the South. So improving that agriculture, changing it, adapting it, or bringing in new technologies, I think is something that really works. A lot of the rest we're still working through. So one of the things that we're doing is so all communes, all communities in the South do a biannual local development plan where they sit together with their local government leaders and say, we are missing 5 schools and 2 health centers, and a road between this market and this town would be really helpful. They sit down and do that kind of needs assessment for themselves every 2 years. And then they prioritize, okay, of the 5 schools and the road and the health centers, which one is really critical? And then that kind of participatory prioritization goes back to government to inform their planning. So that's already in place in Madagascar. One of the things we're doing is to bring climate change impacts into that planning exercise. So in that consultation, people also get to say, oh, it's the coastal erosion which is really affecting our fishing, or it's the drought which is really affecting our health services, or it's the drought which is really affecting our rice production. So bring in a lens of climate change into that planning, and then make sure that that prioritization exercise is also meeting those climate change priorities. So we're working with the government on a pilot for exactly that. So kind of integrate climate change concerns into that local development planning process, and seeing then if that then informs kind of government development planning, which is more sensitive to climate change. So we'll see. It might make a difference as well.
And I was going to ask, like, when you do that, you're introducing climate change into this. What's the time horizon that you can look at before people are like, oh, that's too far? Like we got a problem this year. We had a drought 4 years ago. We need solutions now because I feel like climate change I mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in many parts of the world still is very distant. It's very intangible, but it's also in areas that I'm seeing, say in Southeast Asia, we're already seeing 4 to 6 degrees Celsius change. We're already seeing huge kind of like rain bombs coming out of the sky and wiping out entire cities and communities. Without that, I found that you don't get quite so much of a lean in from these stakeholders. They just feel like, oh, we've already got this problem, we know about it. So, how far of a timeline can you give them, and how do you present scenarios? Like, do you present it as like in 3 years, this is what we expect, scientific models are showing this, and that's the impact to you? Like, do you have to be super granular in how a degree difference matters to their fields, or like what creates engagement so they build that climate awareness modeling scenarios into their own planning?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And again, we're still learning, what is effective communication between the global debates and the global modeling and the global statistics and what really matters to local people. And I know we haven't tried it in Madagascar, but there has been some amazing innovation around, providing meteorological advice and providing predictions through text messaging and apps and for people to have that information. Whether that information is usable, whether that information really counts for people, I think we're still trying to figure out. But certainly people know they may not know that their environment is changing, and they may not know that what the drivers of that change are, but they feel it on they know the year when there was less water. They know the year when there was a good crop. They know the year when there was a plague of locusts. They know the year when the fishing stocks really went down. Whether people kind of add all of those things into this global concept of climate change, I'm not sure. But they certainly know what they're experiencing because they're very close to their environment. They know that the trees are disappearing. They know that because the trees are disappearing, that changes the water runoff patterns. And that's their daily reality. Whether they feel kind of empowered and able to do something about that is the bit that I think we step in.
Stepping back a bit from the research, you mentioned that you came up through anthropology into the space. What drew you into the social dimensions of climate change to begin with, like on a personal level? And what is it about this work that really motivates you, excites you, keeps you going at times, I'm guessing, where you're seeing a lot of real human challenges?
It's that potential to put people into the picture. I mean, another whole side of what we're doing is actually on the mitigation front. So when countries are going through energy transitions, when countries are going through big water management transitions, again, are local people being factored into that process. So it's great, for example, for a country to like South Africa to be going through the energy revolution that it is. But what about the people who've made their livelihoods in coal mines all their life? It's great for the DRC to be thinking about expanding exportation of green minerals, which is so in demand at the moment. That could be a real growth area for them. But what about those people that are working in the mines under very poor conditions? So it's great that Mozambique is thinking about more hydropower and thinking about building bigger dams. But what about the people who are going to lose their land as the river is flooded to make space for the dam and the hydro? So it's the social justice part of all of this. These transitions are needed. It's the direction that the world needs to go in. Um, but there are winners and losers in that process. And how do we make sure that it's actually a win-win situation and that this big global change is not to the detriment of local people whose needs and livelihoods might be forgotten in that process as it becomes more urgent, as it becomes more critical. So I think there's a real driving force of justice in all of this and making sure that this works for all, especially for those poorest people who have contributed least to climate change, but are going to be most affected by the impacts.
But then personally, how did you come into the work? Like, how did you go from anthropology into the World Bank and working with populations and really trying to understand that social element?
Yeah, I started off academically. So I started off with a PhD in anthropology and went and did my field work in Uganda. So I did a year and a half living in a refugee camp in northern Uganda just after the civil war. Personally, extraordinarily tough experience to live, very rural, very poor community just after a civil war. And I was interested in how people were picking up the pieces and putting their lives together when there wasn't any aid or development or government was, what was it that they were turning to, whether that was financial resources or spiritual resources or mental resources, what was getting them through that experience. And I always did that PhD with a view to working in international development, but with a view to working in international development with this kind of bottom-up view, with this local level view. If none of us was there, if this architecture of aid wasn't there, what would people do for themselves? And then how can the aid and development architecture build on that? And from that, I transitioned into working with NGOs, actually worked in local government in my own country in the UK for a couple of years, really trying to figure that question out for myself, for my own country, rather than, going around the world and trying to tell other people how to do it. A bit of a humbling experience to say, well, it's not like we've got it all figured out in Southeast London, many, many problems there. And what does it take to really effectively communicate with people who are from a different background from you? What does it take to really motivate people to care about their communities? What does it take to really deal with disenfranchisement? So that's really been the theme of what I've done is make sure there's local voice in there.
Going back to Uganda, I mean, I'm about to celebrate my 30th anniversary living overseas. Few people will step out of that comfort and go into a really difficult condition. And I'm sure that there were 20 other paths you could have taken that would put you in the exact same place you are now. Why did you feel it was important to take that step and go to Uganda? And what'd you take away from it that you think was foundational to your own perspective on the issues, to the way that you adapted your career around solving those issues? Like, why was that such a formative experience for you? And what did you take away from it?
Yeah, I think I've always recognized that I've had a bit less of a risk aversion than other people, a bit more of a spirit of adventure, perhaps, kind of really stepping out of my comfort zone. That's just part of my personality. But it helps. It helps because then you have the curiosity to live and work in different places. I've stayed in touch with that community in Uganda over 25 years now, since I did my PhD. And I go back as often as I can. And it's been extraordinary to watch their history of development. They are in a much better place now than they were 25 years ago when they really were in abject poverty. The first girls from that community kind of just went to university, which is an incredible achievement after coming from such a basic post-war level. So I think I'm just fascinated by that and by people, by the history of change. And in some ways, there are huge advantages in it, in the fact that girls are now going to university. And of course, there are disadvantages in it. The families are more fragmented. Everybody complains of a breakdown of social capital. People are on the move a much more. So sense of community is really, really kind of being eroded. So we all know that. We all know that kind of conundrum of development, the pros and the cons. But I think, yeah, I'm just fascinated by that process of what does it really take for people to be better off. And I suppose I'm passionate about the fact that no one should have to live in poverty in this world of ours where we have huge and incredible resources in the world. It's unacceptable that anybody is living in poverty. So to have had that perspective from a very local level, that's what drives me. And then to know those people over 25 years and to have seen their courage and their determination is an incredible thing.
So does having a through line like that, like having that longitudinal understanding of how things could get better, how does that sit with you, like when you're looking at, say, this Madagascar and DRC project? Like, do you actually look at this like, yeah, this is a tough time, sure, but I've seen where this can happen. And does that help you get through maybe some of the challenging conversations, the research, the data that might not be coming your way? I'm really curious because for me, I've seen the similar in Asia, and it's like we are incredibly capable of doing amazing stuff. And yeah, I'm looking at this right now, so I don't get so down when I'm seeing that challenge. I really look at it as like, no, it's going to get better. We just have to find the right path. Do you have something similar? Has that, 25-year relationship really shaped your view of what development can and should look like? It's just a matter of time and a little bit more effort from us?
Yeah, I think it, like you, I think it really helps. It really helps me to be pragmatic and to know the things over which an organization like the World Bank can have an impact and the things that we just can't. So I would say the single biggest driver of that development in that community in Uganda has been political stability. The fact that the war ended, the fact that there was peace, the fact that people were not in fear for their lives and they could actually think about something a little longer term than just kind of, saving themselves. The fact that they could start planning for the future, they could start investing, they could start having visions for what they wanted for their children. So political stability and lack of conflict has been the determinant of that. And that's beyond my control. I am not the agent that can achieve political stability in Madagascar. That is not my role, and that is not the role of the World Bank. But it helps to figure out what is our contribution in that circumstances. And then I think just being very pragmatic about, some will win and some will lose. So in that community in Uganda, some people have been amazingly successful and some have been less successful. And it's just a very kind of differentiated experience. And so you can't have one thing that's going to work for everybody. You have to try a lot of things. And sometimes it will go wrong. Sometimes it just won't work. So I do think having that longer view is, we in international development can't change the world tomorrow. It takes forever and it's very political and there are a lot of things which are beyond your control. So you just have to find the bit over which you have influence and try and make sure that that works well.
Which leads me to my last question, which was if others are looking to follow your own path through, say, the World Bank or through social development, anthropology into impact, what advice would you give them as they're going along in their journey? Like two or three pieces.
So I would say get out to a different context than the one you know. I mean, the world is obviously very different now from when I did my first stay in Uganda. You can go anywhere in the world and be connected, and you can go anywhere in the world and still feel in touch with bigger global developments. But to the extent that you can go to somewhere where you are where you're challenged and you're learning about the difference of that community or how people do things. I see a lot of people come into the World Bank and they have only ever worked in capital cities of developing countries. And that's not to say they're not brilliant at what they do, but they lack that perspective of just what it feels like to work somewhere different and all that cultural negotiation that you need to do and sometimes misunderstanding that happens and language differences and you need to experience that if you're going to work in international development because that's a lot of the job, especially now. It's a lot of the job is working alongside people who come from different political, cultural, and social backgrounds from you. And the skill set that you have in being able to work with people, work cross-culturally, and to negotiate cultural difference is going to be absolutely indispensable. So go and do it. Go and try. Go and live out of your comfort zone, and see how that works. And be humbled in that process, because I think we all go along this trajectory of thinking that we've got a lot to offer, and then turning around and realizing that we've got a lot to learn. So I would say that. I would say, keep humble. No one has the solution. No one has the fix. These are really complex challenges. So learn from the people around you who have contributions to that, and be good to those people in the process and acknowledge their contribution and try to build other people up. And just remember how rewarding and this is, despite its challenges, I think.